So we're attempting a couple different things today since we're having, we started doing our Tuesday events. So in our programming as a congregation, in Toronto congregation, we have our traditional Sunday morning services, which are including church class. And we have two church classes, the adult class, and now we have children's class. And then we have our regular worship service after that, followed by the social time. And then we have we've initiated a Tuesday night events too, every Tuesday at 7. And so at our Tuesday events, we have each Tuesday we have a different event. And so the first Tuesday of the month is essentially our mission initiative, which is the Develop Disciples to Serve, or Continually Learn and Grow, is one of the ones we're thinking about or we will focus on. And so it's a bunch of different ideas and lectures, people who have expertise in different fields or different members who want to present on different topics. And so that's the week that we're on right now. Another one of the second week is what we call the Spiritual Formation Week. And so this is when we are going to, that's like one of the new terms coming out really out of headquarters is a lot of is spiritual formation. And so that represents a lot of the components that some of the older members of the congregation maybe are less familiar with. We're very used to our traditional service, but as we maybe introduce some of the other kinds of different ways that people explore spirituality and are doing that at church headquarters and things like that, we're introducing those kind of on Tuesday so that it isn't as scary as if we were to just suddenly do something very different on Sunday. And so one of the things that we do, even in spiritual practice, that can be everything from things like meditation, and we'll have meditation class, but another thing can be simply as something as simple as like hymn practice. So as we have been singing hymns together as a spiritual practice, and as we've embraced our new hymnal, that's been one of the things we've been doing. On the third week, we'll be having, as soon as we have books for it, we'll be having a book club where we kind of are reading different things that'll be like philosophical topics or history topics or topics relating to spirituality, life issues, all that kind of thing. And so we'll read books together and discuss them. And then the fourth Tuesday is a Movies That Matter, which a lot of different, you do that in Community Place and in GTA West, but it's the idea of it is where you watch again one of those kind of movies that has the same kind of topic as the books, and then we're able to discuss it afterwards. Okay, what does this mean in our lives? Has talking on this topic opened up anything that we want to have dialogue with each other? And in a lot of reasons, one of the reasons why we're doing all of those things is because we don't necessarily think that the whole idea of what church even is has to be limited to the way we've done it traditionally. We're not stopping the way we've done it traditionally because we think that that's very meaningful and very valuable. But there's all sorts of other ways that one can be connected. One can explore, what do you value in life? What is life for? What are you doing together in community? And this is the kind of thing where in a lot of our daily lives, where we work in, let's say, an office environment or something like that, you're around the water cooler as your main socializing with people. You don't really talk about those kind of issues of value usually. Usually you're just talking about, whatever the recent Game of Thrones episode or something like that is what you're able to talk about, and that's where a lot of our lives are. Then the final component also of what we're doing is more what we call missional or service activities. So just the things where you're doing things that are actively for a cause. And so one of the ones that we did in the area here that Chuck and I went around, for example, is we made sandwiches and lunch boxes and with juice and things like that. And we walked around in the neighborhood here. There's a whole bunch of people who are underhoused or living in the area, and it's not that they can't necessarily get food. They can at the different shelters and things like that, but in a lot of cases people are completely not feeling like they're part of community and society and everything like that. People cross the street to not talk to people because people don't want to be asked for money or anything like that. And so instead, we just sought people out so that we could talk to them and find out their stories. And people had a wide variety of different stories about why they ended up living in our neighborhood here. And so anyway, so that kind of a thing. So in other words, we are trying to explore like a wide variety of what it means to be a church, and those don't necessarily involve coming to a traditional Sunday service, although it can. And so that actually is the topic tonight about what I actually want to present on. So just this taking us out of the way we think about church, the way we've always kind of thought about church, and broaden that concept of what church even is. And so I'm entitled this topic, this discussion, Church for the Unchurched. And I'm saying that I'm making the case for non-dogmatic religion in the 21st century. And this is what maybe sometimes people call, when they say that they are spiritual but not religious. What do they necessarily even mean by that? This would be spiritual, but maybe not religious, except for if we think about what religion even means. If you're exercising this kind of spirituality together in a group of people, then maybe, in fact, we can reclaim even what religion even means and making it valuable to ourselves again. Okay. So to start off, just as a way of background, I can just mention a little bit about my own unexpected journey in all of this. And so I made this as kind of like a timeline of my life from when I was born, until the present, and divided that into three main component groups. And so from birth until I turned 18, I was a member of the Mormon Church, the LDS Church. And so I was raised a pretty typical Mormon, although by the time I was a teenager, I was kind of a doubting Mormon. And specifically, I left the church over just the way the church practice excluded women from leadership roles, and still does. And so it was just something that I felt socially, it just didn't jive with me and what I was willing to and able to have in a social setting in a church that I would be affiliated with. And so I left it as of an adult when I became an adult and didn't have to go anymore. And I spent the whole vast proportion of my life in a condition which can be called unchurched, or it's also called unaffiliated. And so if you're asked on a survey, what religion are you? What is your religious affiliation? And you answer none. So it's like you're one of the nuns is what people call that. So nuns, but not in the sense of wearing a traditional Catholic nun, but nuns. So I instead was focused on academic study. So my training was actually in ancient and medieval history, where I learned an awful lot about the history of religion and the medieval religion. And then I also focused on one of my interests, something that I've always found to be a great love of my life, something that I find very valuable, which is the production of books. So designing, typesetting, doing book illustration, cover design, writing, editing, so all the process of creating books. And then it was much more recently, so in 2010, that I then joined Community of Christ, and so ending that nun period. And now I actually have a religious affiliation. And as of this year, I've been serving as the pastor of the downtown Toronto congregation of Community of Christ, which is where we're presenting this and also live streaming this. So just to talking about nuns. The Pew Research Center, which is the main academic center that is tracking information on religious affiliation, mostly in the United States, but all around the world too. This is trends in religious affiliation in the U.S. Maybe can't read that very easily from where you are, or maybe especially from the stream. But what this is a graph of. So we're going from 1972 to 2010, and what you can kind of see here is, starting up at the top, starting in 1972, when asked the question, what is your religious affiliation? What religion are you? 62% of people in the United States said that they were Protestant. 26% of people in the US said they were Catholic. And 7% said they had no religious affiliation. So there's other people in the percentages too. So to get to the 100 on that, you'd have Jewish people and other kinds of other religious answers, but those aren't listed on this graph. And so you can kind of see a kind of a slow decline from 1972 to 2010, which is not intensely dramatic, but it is, not a decline, not a thing that's going up, which is in the Protestant line, where it goes from 62 to 51% of people in 2010 are saying that they're Protestant. The Catholic line is pretty much the solid, so it's still about a quarter of the population identify as Catholic, and then making up the gap, essentially, as Protestants have been going down, is people who say none. So as of 2010, 18% of people were saying that they don't have any religious affiliation. And this is sometimes, I think, overstated a little bit in the, we've probably heard a bunch of different stories on this in the media, just like essentially the collapse of religion and how nobody's religious anymore and all this kind of thing. We are still, it's more than this now than in the most latest data. This is only taking it to 2010, it's 2015 now. And so there's a definite trend line here, but we still are talking about a minority of people. I mean, less than a quarter of the people that are identifying as no religious affiliation. But the important thing, and why it makes news and why it's getting reported is so that this is an uptick in a trend. So the trend is going this way, and it's especially trending this way because if you do a demographic breakdown, it's much higher among the youngest people, in the survey, and this is also so the number that is 50% of the people that are saying that they're Protestant. That's including lots and lots of people that are older than 60, let's say. And so that's why even though it's a minority of the population, it's newsworthy or makes news. The other reason why too is it's making a higher proportion not only of young people but also white people, people with higher education, and people who are more affluent. So it's in some ways all of those demographics that people are chasing for television advertising. And this is one of the reasons why the Catholic line is constant, because there's substantial immigration coming into the United States. So this is actually a little different in Canada than in the United States. In Canada, the nuns percentage tracks a few percentage points higher. And in fact, I think that the Catholic line isn't holding anywhere near as constant, and instead that there's a rise of affiliated members of non-Western religions. So there's plenty more as a percentage. There's a bunch of people who are Jewish and Muslim, Hindu in the United States, but it's a higher percentage in Canada. Okay, so what are the reasons? And people have been trying to kind of figure this out, because it's obviously whenever there's a big demographic shift, people want to know, why is that happening? And I think that there's a bunch of different reasons why traditional religions in North America, are not having as much appeal, why people are disaffiliating, and different people have given different reasons why. So, but I'm going to argue that I think one of the reasons why is that many traditional religions in North America promote dogmatic teachings that fail to stand up to scrutiny and lack evidence. And so this is especially been true through the 20th century with the rise of fundamentalism. So although we may think of fundamentalism as having been the way religion was all the way into the past, and certainly when we think of Muslim fundamentalism, people sometimes describe that as being medieval, or they talk about ISIS as if ISIS were medieval. In point of fact, it's actually an intensely modern phenomenon. Fundamentalism of all stripes is a very modern phenomenon that is a reaction to modernity. And it is not how people believed in the Middle Ages. It's not how people acted in any way in the Middle Ages. It's how a group of modern people are reacting in the present to modernity. But part of the issue with it is, as a reaction to modernity, fundamentalism is specifically anti-science and it rejects empiricism, for example. So it makes claims that are falsifiable in the scientific worldview, and therefore people in general, I think, assume that all religion is like that and is making falsifiable claims. And so then people are like, well, why would I be involved in anything that clearly doesn't make any sense? So this would be like believing that the world is only 6,000 years old, or believing that that the Noah story means that there was once a universal flood where the entire world, let's say 4,000 years ago, was covered in water or something like that, which is not what like all Christianity teaches, but this is what fundamentalist Christians teach. Okay, that's one reason. Another reason, I think, many traditional religions place extreme emphasis on ideas of sexual morality that became fixed in the early 20th century and are now widely out of step with contemporary practices. And so that's almost self-evident, I think, to say that, right? And so there's an idea of 50s sexual morality and ethics and even gender roles that are now so completely out of step with how people live their lives that people feel like that if they're going to go into a church, they're going to have to cross this entire hurdle. And so we've even had that here in this church as we've moved to this new place. We specifically put one of our signs out on the front, and it says a welcoming congregation, and we have a rainbow symbol on there to indicate that presumably to anybody in the know that means obviously our church is fully inclusive of the LGBTQIA community. And yet, the very first thing when a couple of people have emailed me and they've said, "Oh, I see that you're opening a church in the area. The first thing I have to know is what is your position on gay people, because I'm gay, and I've been involved in churches, and the churches have really hurt me. And I'm a Christian. This is very meaningful in my life, and yet my own community has been damaging to me." And so there's a lot of times people, are feeling that way, that in themselves something that they have to navigate. That's a barrier to entry to affiliation, and not just for gay people, but let's say, the most let's say couples in Toronto, they're not sexually active prior to getting married. They, generally speaking, will live together for numerous years before they will be formally married, although by Canadian law that does mean they get married through the common law process. And even that, though, they might think, okay, well, this can be a very serious problem to membership, and the church might be judging me for that. Okay, so that's a problem when churches do that. Also, a big deal, and we kind of touched on it, is the noisy intrusion of religious fundamentalists into North American politics, especially in the US. I don't think it's as bad in Canada. Anyway, it has equated, and this has happened ever since the 1970s, there was the rise of the religious right in the US. There is equated the idea of religion in general with political conservatism. And the combination, I think, of religion and politics has caused resentment. It's in general terms, politics, while these are the two things that people like to argue about or hate to argue about, are religion and politics. But when you have it in society, when you have them wedded together, when the church becomes the state, then the church immediately takes on all of the horrific baggage of the state. And so if you have, let's say, personal grievances or feelings or bad sense about, let's say, one of the two political parties in the United States, if you're a Democrat and George W. Bush is president, you don't like that. And same thing, Republicans today, are incensed and angry and feel really upset in this currently polarized environment that Obama is the president right now. And so if you have that additionally, the political system is additionally wed to the church, this has just been a truism throughout history. It doesn't work very well. So this was a problem that the medieval papacy was wrestling with all the time. When the popes were temporal rulers and they had to, in some cases, put armor on, get a sword, get on the back of a horse, and lead an army into battle, besiege a city, and kill everybody when they took the city over, which is what you had to do in the Middle Ages to conquer places. Then people weren't looking at the guy who's doing that as being a particularly spiritual person, and so this connection of church and state is bad for churches, even though a group, in this case in North America, in the United States, of religious people felt like it was a big deal for them. They wanted to establish a theocracy. A lot of times religious people, or people with a certain kind of religion, do want to establish a theocracy, or they do want to impose their ideals or their values onto the society. But in fact, it's a short-sighted, I think from a historical perspective, this is a very short-sighted desire, because what you end up doing, the more you connect the two, church and state, you actually really drive people away from the church. People don't like the church when you separate it out, and when there's pluralism, when all the churches are free to have a free exercise of ideas and everything like that, then the churches all actually thrive lots more. And this is one of the reasons why I believe anyway that North America, the affiliation question here, this is so much different from in Europe. So throughout Europe, most of the European countries have established religions, where the Church of England is actually the church, that the government runs, and you get your tax money goes to support it, and the Queen, who's the head of state, is actually the head of the church. And that's true, in Denmark and stuff too. In other words, where your tax money is going to that. So the rise of the non-affiliated, or the nuns in Europe, is just way farther along that. So that graph that we saw, for us in North America, where we're at 18 to 24% or wherever it is, that's more like 70% in Europe. It's much further along. Okay. And then that last point is what I kind of just have said. So there's this idea in the religious right that religious liberty, right now anyway, there's this argument that religious liberty is opposed to civil rights. And so this is the opposite actually of what is reality. So from the start in the Anglo-American world, freedom of religion is being understood to be the separation of church and state. Because if you actually have an established church, that means that you don't have freedom of religion. It means you are supporting one particular religion, right? But what has people right now in the United States especially, kind of are feeling like is that unless they can establish their particular religion, which is to say fundamentalist Protestantism, unless they can impose that on the rest of the country, that they are themselves being persecuted, or that they are not able to exercise their religious liberty. And so that they are in fact actually seeing the denial of other people's civil rights, civic and human rights, as being actually a thing that's against their religious freedom. And so it's a misguided thing, but it's something that's happening, and it's one of the reasons why I think overall the entire picture is really quite poisoned for people who aren't intimately connected with a different kind of church, let's say, than what you're just seeing in the general media. Okay, so with that background, of where we're at in terms of the demographics, where we're at in terms of the general overall perception of religion in North America. And if we just take, though, let's say, all of these components of what, as a puzzle piece, religion consists of in the popular mindset, and we just throw some of those things away. So I left, the church of my youth over the issue of sexism. Let's get rid of that in the church. The idea that the church is anti-science, or has to be anti-science, that there's this dogma, that it's anti-gay, that it's very literalistic. So if we threw those pieces away, if we took those pieces out of the puzzle of what constitutes religion, is that possible to do? In other words, or are those not just little pieces, is that actually structural? Is that actually what religion is? Is there nothing left worth saving if we don't have those components to it? And so, as that question, so literalism, isn't religion always a profession of faith or belief in the truth of a doctrine and authority based on feelings, let's say, the spirit, rather than on other evidence from empiricism? So a lot of people just take that as being what religion even is, right? So you have this sort of truth proposition, and it's based on a strict doctrine that is just, this and that and the other thing is what the way things are and what the meaning of life is, and you have that as a list of things, and you also have authority, And so that authority is either coming from a text, so the Bible, and that is the sole source of authority for some religions, or let's say a leader. So the leader is connected directly to God, and you're speaking, and the God is speaking through the leader for you, and that's the authority, or whatever it is. So in other words, religion is based on a doctrine or a set of rules that is coming that are authoritative, and you have to believe in them or have faith in them based on maybe feelings that you have, that you feel in your heart that it's great or something like that, or that it must be true, or that it must be the way it is, and you have that as opposed to all other evidence that you might have, let's say like empiricism or utility or any other way that you're testing ideas and knowledge. And so that's certainly one perception that people have about what religion is, and that is certainly how a lot of religion is. And so I don't want to argue that doesn't exist, but rather I'm going to argue, however, that not all religion is that way. The religion hasn't historically always been that way, and religion doesn't need to be that way. So that is one way it can be, and it's problematic for all the reasons that we've talked about, but we don't have to have that. So I also want to talk for just briefly about this idea of religion as a force for change. A lot of times where we are in society, we think of religion as being a negative force right now because society is trying to progress. We keep on changing and going forward. And if anything, religion is holding us back, or our organized religion or churches in North America or in Europe and the West are holding us back. But I want to make the point that all doesn't happen throughout history. And so a lot of times when I look at things, like I say, I studied medieval and ancient history, and I tend to look at things from a much longer time span perspective than just, let's say, my own lifetime or a recent past or anything like that. And so from a couple examples, just to pull a couple out. So Quakers and other activists, in the 18th and especially the 19th century, were massively important in stopping the slave trade and then also slavery. So in other words, they were the force that was catalytic for ending that institution. Now, simultaneously, there were other religious leaders and other organized religions that were quite sympathetic to slavery and that were backing it up theologically. So if you were a slave owner in the American South, you were being able to go to a Southern Baptist church, and they were quoting all kinds of different authoritative scriptures, and their interpretation of them was that this is how the world should be. But simultaneously, other religions, other organized religions, the Quakers and other, say, progressive religions, were actively fighting against that interpretation. Just pulling it back, this is, when people think of the Middle Ages, the church as being this force for just, we like to have it in our story that the church was this force for keeping the Dark Ages dark, as people think of this horrible medieval times. And so you probably have seen in movies or in fantasy movies this idea that you could have a judicial trial by combat. So people want to have two knights, one of them has dishonored the other one or something like that, and they say, you've dishonored me, and they have to do a challenge. And well, later on they had it became in modern times, it was dueling, and they would slap each other with the gloves and shoot with paces and that kind of thing, so dueling, right? But in the Middle East, before they had guns, there was an idea of trial by combat where you have a sword fight. In point of fact, however, that this trial by ordeal was customary law. This was the kind of thing that you can imagine knights thought of and knights liked, and this was kind of a knightly secular theory of how justice should work. But the church and canon law actually were absolutely opposed to this, and so that it was councils of the church that said no. This doesn't equate to justice if you were just going to have a big sword fight and decide who is the murderer or not based on who wins the sword fight, or whose honor is right, or who was lying about this or that, who stole what property, who is the rightful owner of that property. And so instead, the church pulled from Roman law, which included things like different ways of investigate. You have a statute. You investigate it. You would later have trials by jury, where you have a jury of your peers. In other words, all of the things that evolved into our current legal system, that those evolved out of church law and church reforms as the church tried to impose more just standards on society that was very happy to just duke it out. Another example coming out of the Middle Ages is the creation of the institution of the university and schools even. And in fact, science itself, which comes out of the medieval institution of the monasteries. So throughout all of the Middle Ages, the people that were the scientists, the people that were preserving all scientific knowledge, were in fact the monks and the clerics, and they also the people who created universities, which are a medieval institution. And indeed, the reason why people today dress up in clerical robes and wear cleric or church hats, which is to say medieval monastic robes during a graduation, or in other words, the very most formal event of schooling. The reason why you then dress up in clerical robes is because you are remembering that at a certain point you had to be a cleric, or in other words, being a cleric meant going to university or being educated or doing that kind of thing. And it was because the church in its canons was constantly saying, no, we need to actually promote knowledge and learning and get everybody to be better trained. And that's why we have, for example, the word clerk, like a law clerk or a clerk in a store. That's just cleric. It's because those are the only people that were actually trained, because that was what schools were. So anyway, those were examples. It's not always negative. It hasn't always been the forces that are against knowledge the way we maybe think of modern fundamentalist religions today. If we're going to go all the way back to the antiquity, so we have in the Bible, this is not actually history, but it's a story in the Bible where we have this story of Abraham and Isaac. And this is often cited by modern fundamentalist Christians as an example that justifies pretty well them doing anything as long as they think God told them to do it. So in the story, Abraham, who has been childless, and he's finally been promised by God that he will have the son. He has the son, and then he's told by God to go and offer a human sacrifice of the son. And he takes the kid up, or it's actually not said it's a kid in the story, but anyway, he takes his son up, whatever age he was, and they go to sacrifice him on the altar. And then at the last minute, the angel comes and stops Abraham from sacrificing his son, and then instead they substitute a ram. And so essentially, as interpreted by people often or generally, this is an example of you should be just blindly obedient to whatever horrific thing God is telling you in your head to do, and even up till and including being prepared to kill somebody, including your own son or your own children, in order to do it. And so generally speaking, the story is really quite awful, and it's used quite awfully. But what it actually refers to, and what it actually goes back to, is at the time period when this story was created, when this myth was first told by religious leaders, by the prophets who created this story. What this story was doing was it was taking an existing practice, which was a religious practice, but it was a pre-monotheistic religious practice. So it was a pagan practice that was completely ubiquitous among the ancient Israelites, which was that the very firstborn, of every person, of every woman, or the firstborn child, must always have to be offered as a sacrifice. So that would be true for humans, and it would be true for animals or anything like that. And so there are commandments. We can tell that this is true because we actually have other sources outside the Bible that talks about how the ancient Canaanites and Phoenicians and Punic peoples did this sacrifice of the firstborn all the time. And so we have the exterior sources that tell us how to do it, but then we have all kinds of internal sources within the Bible that are explaining this. So for example, there are special commandments in the Levitical Code that are telling people, do not sacrifice your firstborn. You normally don't have to be told not to do something like that, unless that was something that everybody was already doing. So they were already doing that. And same thing, the idea of even of the Passover, right? So the Passover is that the destroying angel is going to come and destroy all the firstborns. But what do? Instead, there's a religious ritual now where we can substitute an actual human sacrifice or an animal sacrifice instead, which is obviously, we don't necessarily want to be killing animals right now in the 21st century, but you can easily see in the 6th and 7th century before the Common Era how going from human sacrifice to a substitution practice is in fact a very positive religious reform. And so the story of Abraham is a created precedent which is explaining to people, stop sacrificing your children, people. You don't have to do that. That's not what God wants. So in point of fact, even this story is an example of how religious leaders were attempting to, religious reformers are attempting to promote positive change in cultural practices. And so that's not to say, I'm not trying to go through in making these different little points and saying religion was always a force for good. There was often bad. But my main point is that trends, all of these trends, we kind of see all of our trends because we have such a short time frame, let's say in our lives, from the early to middle to late 20th century to the present. We are seeing history going in, let's say, one line where there was fewer smartphones and now we have better smartphones and everything is there's going to be a better smartphone next year or something like that. So in other words, there's always one line, but in point of fact, trends go ebb and flow throughout human history, and including especially for social trends. So at a certain point in the Middle Ages, so we sometimes think, okay, just as another example, we sometimes think that everybody was way more sexually hung up in the past or more modest in the past and less so now. And so we think of, for example, Muslims, with the burqa, they're making women wear this from head to toe and only be covered and everything like that. And that is in theory, like some kind of a medieval garb. But nobody in the Middle Ages had clothes like that. The only people who could potentially even have any kind of clothes like that were at the royal courts or something like that. And so that didn't exist as a practice back then. And in the Christian Middle Ages, in the early medieval period, people didn't think twice about nudity. So there was public nudity all the time. That was not a big deal to people. There were public baths before the Black Death. So they decided that the baths were causing the plague, which is not right. So anyway, so in medieval Europe, though, they loved public bathing and all those kind of things, and they were not worried about that kind of thing. But in other words, people became more and more and more modest to a certain point, and that kind of had a big highlight in the Victorian era. And so then the pendulum has swung a different way since then. But it's not that it was just always more and more and more and more and more that way. In other words, it goes back and forth, and all of these kind of social trends go back and forth. So, as North Americans in the post-war era, our experience with religion is largely a conservative force reacting against social change and progress. And so we mainly tend to, like I've just been saying, extrapolate from our experience and assume that religion in general throughout time has been antagonistic to change and social progress. Okay. So one of the reasons for that is that the kind of religion that we are most familiar with in the United States is a doctrine in Canada, in North America. I gave this presentation originally in the US. So in North America it's a doctrine-focused religion. So the last time organized religion in North America was significantly retooled, the bulk of the population had either an elementary or a high school educations. So it's very different from the situation now where the bulk of, or at least a very large percentage of the population now has had the opportunity to go to college and even graduate school. Back then especially, primary education was about the memorization of facts. And so one of the things I am struck by, I watched an old movie like The Wizard of Oz. And if you think about it, the scarecrow who didn't have a brain, how did he ultimately prove, that he had a brain?
Square root or something?
Yeah, he says the square root of it. He quotes the Pythagorean theorem. And so what he's done is he's shown that he has the hypotenuse of the right triangle or whatever. So he has proven that he has memorized, a math equation. And so what education was about was memorizing answers. And so that's what being smart is about when you're in a situation where everybody is only having primary and secondary education. You learn your reading, writing, and arithmetic, which is about memorizing stuff, and even history, memorizing dates and facts and things like that. When you go, by contrast, to being college educated, you are instead taught critical thinking. And so instead of memorizing answers, you are actually taught to question answers. Where did that come from? Why are we saying that? Why is that the answer to that? What is the basis for that? That kind of a thing. So from this time period, though, when the bulk of the population both learned that way, and that was their entire worldview, for religions, which were retooled at that time period, in the early 20th century was the last major retooling, memorizing doctrine or having doctrines, having answers to questions was eminently satisfying to the different people. So today, a high share of the North American population has attended college, and as I've just said, post-secondary education emphasizes critical thinking. The problem is that religions that have continued to focus on doctrine, which is to say memorized truths, they have their teachings that are empty and dissatisfying to many people trained in critical thinking. Now, this doesn't mean that it's dissatisfying to everybody, because there's a whole bunch of people for whom this is a very valid and valuable way of having meaning in their life. But there's a whole chunk of the population, which, by the way, happens to correspond to the chunk that we're saying is increasingly saying that they're unaffiliated. There's a whole chunk of the population for whom this is eminently unsatisfying. Okay, so what do we deal with, though? Okay, so how do we explain the past, is what I want to say. So what about critical thinkers of the past? So in other words, we have this kind of religion now that is eminently satisfying to people who haven't gone to college, let's say. But in the past, there were universities, even if it's not 50% of the population that went to it, it might have only been 5% at the beginning of the 20th century, or if you get into the early modern period of time, it is like one in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 or something like that. So it's a very tiny percentage of the population when you get back into the Middle Ages and antiquity. So there have been critical thinkers continuously from at least the time of Socrates. So if religion is no more than the simplistic dogmas, how do we explain great Christian thinkers like Augustine, Boethius, Anselm of Bec, Abelard, Thomas Aquinas, Descartes, etc.? My explanation is, while the vast majority of the population experienced a very satisfying type of religion through memorized doctrine, there was a tiny fraction of the population trained in critical thinking, and they were engaged in the practice of theology, which is to say exploring, reasoning out, and defining meaning. So this practice, even though it was happening and it was only being conducted by a very tiny fraction of the population, this practice, however, just as much as adherence to doctrine, constitutes a legitimate inherited practice of religion, and it turns out that of the two, it is this type, in my opinion, that has the potential to be meaningful to the population most likely to leave religious affiliation, those with a college education. So in other words, the same thing that people who were in medieval universities and found so satisfying in their religion throughout all of the Middle Ages, the early modern times, all the late antiquity and antiquity, the same ways that they were able to be religious are still possible now. It's just different from memorizing doctrines. So, just talking about this inheritance. So, when we're talking about anything, all of our inheritance from the past, we live in the present, and what we have from the past is inherited. So with each component of our inheritance, every single thing that we have in all of our society, everything that we have to think about, everything we're doing, we can choose to attempt to preserve it, we can attempt to renew it, to repurpose it, to completely rework it, or to completely discard it. So that's just what we have for anything. So I'm going to talk about why I think we can take this inheritance and actually use it. But in order to do it, I'm not going to do this baby with the bathwater analogy, because I think that, which is what a lot of people say. Well, when we're throwing religion out, we throw away the baby with the bathwater, is what a lot of people will say. And it's because, and I think when it comes to religion, a lot of the people who are nuns feels that there's no baby in there, right? And that's just something that a lot of people have come to. But just to talk about this in terms of inheritance from the past. So here in Toronto, where we are right here between the building we're in right now and where we live, there's a city. And in between, and the neighborhood that's between here and there is called Cabbagetown. One of the neighborhoods anyway, where we live. And so Cabbagetown is filled with all of these Victorian row houses and everything like that, and it's just this magnificent, beautiful neighborhood that's just filled with walkable spaces, and anyway, is very thriving and has now come to be insanely expensive, too. But what there was an intent to do with the place where we exactly live, though, is just a little north of that in a place called St. Jamestown. And what they did in St. Jamestown was that they tore all those houses down and they built, like a whole series of towers all next to each other. And on the left here, I have Le Corbusier's plan for Paris, where the same thing at the beginning of the modern era, his thought was, why do we need all of these these crazy little old buildings, all these irregular spaces, when in fact, modernity would be everything would be so much more efficient if everything were able to be perfectly standardized, if we had all perfect high-rises, if they were just filled with the same square-built things and they weren't these strange little alleys that opened up and doing all these kind of weird, crazy things. And so his proposal was, let's just level, all of this inheritance from the past that we have, and instead build something really great and perfect and efficient now. And that actually was the operating ideal that people pretty well had throughout the 20th century, from the mid-1920s or so on through the end of the 1970s, when in the name of urban renewal, cities all over North America, they just simply leveled the city as well as they could, and they just built, they mostly built parking lots. But in a lot of cases they built high rises, or they tried to make essentially brand new modern structures. And in a lot of cases, the structures would be places like where I live in St. Jamestown, where they would take an entire block and they make functionally just a dead block, where there's absolutely nothing for anybody to do. They would draw these pictures like this, these architectural pictures, and they would put people like standing on these inhumanly sized plazas. We have this giant vacant plaza, and they would just have people kind of like standing in the middle of it going like this, presumably quoting Socratic dialogues to each other or something like that as how these spaces would have been used. But what ends up happening in practice is you have this entire block where there's no little shops where it's shop, 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 or a restaurant or anything like that, and you just have block after block of dead where there's nothing going on, or it's just essentially everything is designed only for a car or something like that. So these spaces become unliving. And so even though they didn't plan in any way, their goal wasn't in terms of wiping out all of the inheritance of the city cores. The goal was never, hey, let's just kill cities. Let's just make it so that the downtowns are just these sparse, inhuman places that nobody, will want to go to under any circumstances. That wasn't the plan in any way. But that was the result often of what ended up happening with urban renewal. Fortunately, in Toronto, it hardly happened very much at all, because right in the key kind of moment in the middle of the 20th century, Toronto was really poor. And so the city just hardly was able to tear very much of itself down compared to other cities in North America. So like a lot of North American cities, they just leveled everything, and they ripped up their streetcar tracks and everything like that. They couldn't afford to replace the streetcars in Toronto, so we have them still, which is wonderful. And same thing with a lot of those other things. So because the city wasn't able to do it, and because people experienced their pang of, hey, we don't want to tear stuff down a little bit earlier. It started when they were going to tear down the old city hall. And people are like, what are you talking about? Why are we tearing down this magnificent building? And they actually saved it, unlike in a lot of cities. Much more was preserved. Okay, so this is what I'm saying, that there are things that are going on, that are happening in an inheritance, something that may have grown up organically for huge amounts of time, that may seem like it has no sense to it at all. It may not seem like there's any value. It may seem like if you, in our head, we're thinking about, this is supposed to be this way, and wouldn't the plan work so much more perfectly if we had perfect roads and a perfect grid and all of these kind of perfect systems? But a lot of times, it turns out that what we have in our heads for perfection, we only are able to process a couple variables, and we are not actually realizing all of the other living variables that are coming into this organic thing and what makes it so powerful and livable and wonderful. And even nowadays, what's ended up happening now is often suburban cores. They'll tear down a mall and they try to build like a little like living downtown with little stores at the front so that they can try to create the kind of thing that they were tearing down in the 60s and 70s. That only works so well either. But anyway. Okay, so for the component of religion, part of it is going to be, what is religion all by itself? Just even how do we even define that? And so if we were to take this thing and call it religion, and we are separating that off into its own little area, from this whole vast thing of things that are not religion, what is in there, what's out there, and what's the line that's dividing the two from each other? And before I get to that question, I want to ask a similar one, and we can think of a different way that might be easier. So if we were, let's do the same thing, same exercise with natural and artificial. So what's natural mean, and what is artificial?
Well, one's man-made.
Man-made. So the idea of artificial stuff in general is that artificial things are man-made and natural things are not man-made. But the problem with this, as we kind of have started to find out, is that, so this goes back to Aristotle, this distinction between something that's man-made and not, and what is actually natural. But the problem with it is that it actually turns out that people have been making stuff for a lot longer and a lot more broadly than we'd ever imagined. And so nowadays, in terms of being man-made, we're aware, that there is obviously genetically modified crops and things like that. And so in a way, the crop itself is natural, but then the genes that have been changed or that have been inserted, have made it artificial, right? And so now a genetically modified crop, I guess, is artificial, maybe. But it turns out that, that people have been doing that and obviously modifying crops before they had genetic engineering. And so, for example, all of the different kinds of plants that we have that are actually providing wonderful things for us, like corn or big pumpkins or beautiful flowers or anything like that, those have all been bred extensively, in order to be useful or to have properties that humans like, right? And so the idea of those are, in some ways, those have also been man-made or man-affected, right? Or human-affected. And so that actually goes, like even further back to, where does humans start, and cease to be, if you go back into evolution and you're going from primates to modern humans, and where's the line come from when humans become human enough to be counted as what they're doing is man-made or not, right? So for example, we as humans now, modern humans, are actually evolved to wear clothing. The reason why we don't have hair all over our bodies and things like that is because, all the way back into evolutionary times, we already were using tools enough to actually have clothes. And so even before other kinds of sentience or writing or civilization or any of those kind of things, that's something that has happened. That's why, and another example of that is, for example, a component of humans, mostly people with European descent, not East Asians and American Indians, are evolved to, or have evolved now to drink milk from cows. So in other words, not everybody is, some people are lactose intolerant, because you normally would never have had access all through your entire life to milk, but some people have the genes inside them for being able to, or actually for the purposes of surviving on drinking cow's milk, right? And so and what I'm just saying is that even humans themselves, because they have been interacting with their environment so long, that almost the distinction at all between what is natural and artificial is actually much more problematic than we'd ever imagined. And to the extent that almost the idea that people had when Europeans came to North America, that the whole place was this virgin wilderness and things like that, is now turns out is completely a Western ethnocentric idea. And in point of fact, all of the environment of North America and South America had been radically altered by the American Indians, by the First Nations peoples, who had specifically created the environment and the game stock and everything like that in order to have it be the way that they were using it. So in other words, the environment itself, because it has been massively affected by humans, is in fact man-made and artificial, and almost all of our ideas about it. So the idea, a lot of times people will have that they want to do a delta restoration down in Mississippi or something like in Louisiana. The problem with it is that the delta itself now is entirely artificial. We have changed everything so much that we've created it all in this particular way, and trying to get it to go back to the way it was when Europeans first found it is crazy, because that's not how deltas work naturally. So now the entire system is artificial. So this spectrum between what it is I'm suggesting here in this question isn't as simple as when we first think about it. And that's also going to be true for religion, because religion also is one of these ideas that we have thought of in the West, and we have to think about what actually does it mean. So what's inside, what's outside? What's the dividing line between what is religion and what isn't?
To be a belief in some sort of God or divinity.
A belief in some sort of God or divinity. And I think that's going to be, that's going to be what's on my slide. So, so I think that's the most likely answer that people are going to give. So belief in relating to activities to God or the gods, some kind of divinity. That's usually what's maybe inside there as opposed to outside of there. Okay, but there's problems with that. So for example, Buddhism, which I think is generally acknowledged to be one of the great religious traditions of the world, is not a theistic religion. So Buddhism is specifically not concerning itself with belief in God or gods at all. Earlier religions, animism, people who are, we don't have the examples that we have now, or would be the people that are in various hunter-gatherer societies, and they're pretty well dying out now in the 21st century, but still existed within the last few hundred years, and going all the way back. People who are connected to spirits and animal spirits and things like that, and don't have conceptions of God or gods, but instead have these ideas of shamanistic practices and things like that. That's a religion, and it really wouldn't be really inside that boundary line of believing in God. Unitarians who are atheists. The Unitarian tradition is couple centuries old. They meet together in churches. They do a lot of church-style stuff. We have a bunch of Unitarian churches that are here in Toronto that we are ecumenically connected to, and yet a huge proportion of Unitarians now are atheist, and so they don't believe in God or gods or the divine. It's completely possible also in Hinduism. Not all Hindus. A lot of Hindus are very focused on the millions of gods of Hinduism, but Hinduism is a broad enough based religious tradition, and a diverse enough based religious tradition, that you can have an atheist Hindus too. So it can be a non-theistic thing. So the problem with that as a definition of religion all by itself is that there are very obvious religions, including big ones like Buddhism, that are outside of our little boundary that we have for religion, and so therefore religion is existing on both sides of that boundary. And so what we really kind of come to find out is that our idea or our conception or our framework for what religion even is actually rooted in our own ethnocentric tradition. So this is a Western European conception of what religion has been traditionally in the West. And as Europeans sailed all around the world and found other people, they're like, doesn't quite what we think of, but it's kind of the same, so that's what we'll call it we'll swap it out and say that this is the same thing, even if it's actually can't be defined that way. So this is a picture of a First Nations elder in a lodge here in Toronto who is part of in our church we have this Encounter World's Religion program and center, and every year there is an immersion where a religious studies professor spends an hour and a half teaching about like a religious tradition. Then we go meet people in the place of worship of that tradition and meet people in that tradition and see both where they are and interact with them, and they explain their tradition to us. And then you do the next one. And then we go to everything from Sikh Gurdwara to the Catholic Cathedral to the mosque to the Orthodox synagogue and every other kind of place of religious tradition. Well, one of the places that we went to is a First Nations lodge, and the elder here, this was one where I went when I went. He told us that, and in his own attempt to recapture and relearn about First Nations religion, which hasn't been that easy because of First Nations peoples have been had tried to have their religion stamped out by the European settlers, right? So European Canadians, European Americans have attempted to convert everybody to Christianity and to suppress native spirituality. So he went around and asked all of the elders in all of the nations that he was familiar with as he was trying to recover the native traditions and their indigenous spirituality, what is the word for religion? And he was told from every single one of them, he said, that they have no word for religion in their language. That what we now call religion in English has been for us all-encompassing of our activities and our worldview. So in his tradition, or in the native traditions prior to the imposition of this idea of religion, everything that they do is religious as far as they're concerned. So in other words, if you were going to go and hunt or gather, if you were going to make cloth, if you were going to cook, if you were doing anything that you might do, societally or familially, that every one of those things is a component of their religion and their spirituality. And the idea of actually cordoning off the spirituality into a little zone and calling this part the religion and this part not, it actually makes no sense in their tradition. So what he didn't realize, actually, at the time, when he's telling us that prior to contact with Europeans, that his language had no word for religion, what he didn't actually realize is that English also had no word for religion prior to 1492. In our case, it wasn't because of contact that gave us the word for religion, although it was the overall change in perspective that started to happen, as I mentioned, when Europeans started sailing all over the world and getting a broader perspective on things. That's when they came up with the idea of religion, but they didn't have a word for it. So if you said, I am religious in England in the year 1400, what did that mean? So the word religious existed, but didn't mean anything like what it means today. What would it have meant? Do you have any idea?
I'm alive and I'm active.
I'm alive and I'm active, because everybody was religious, right? So everybody would just go around and say that just to say, hi, I'm religious. Nope. In fact, it meant I'm a monk or a nun. So religion meant, and if you were to get religion, or if you were to be religious, or you were to enter religion, it meant you would enter a nunnery or a convent or a monastery. And so that's what the word actually meant at the time. They didn't have the word for religion the way we use it today, however we use it, whatever we mean by it, which I think isn't entirely clear. The lack of a word for religion, however, did not mean that medieval people weren't religious. So, as you're saying, they were religious in our sense of the term, perhaps. However, the idea of cordoning religion off as a distinct thing from non-religion is a modern idea. So they didn't have a way to do that in the Middle Ages, and neither did First Nations people. So like many modern ideas, this newly invented conception definition of religion is rooted in Western ethnocentrism. So what I really want to say is here, this is a new idea. We didn't have a word for it prior to the modern time period. And like a lot of modern ideas, when people first started coming up with modern ideas at the beginning of the modern era, a lot of times it's based on very limited data, and it's based on a lot of ethnocentrism, because when people didn't know anything, they sailed around the world and they felt like everybody around the world was really stupid, and they didn't understand how things were. And it turns out actually that Europeans actually were not very perceptive of how other people were behaving. They didn't have a lot of empathy. They weren't very sophisticated. They just barely had been able to build boats and sail around the world. They weren't actually thinking too highly as like we are able to today. So their conception and coming up with these ideas in a lot of cases are entirely based on their own ethnocentrism, and so they are aware of their own religion, which is Christianity. It had just recently been, or was about to divide into component parts in the West of Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. They're aware of some different religions that they have some intimate connection with. So Judaism, which is a Western religion that is intimately connected with Christianity throughout history. And then they're aware of, as the other, the Muslims, who are in the rest of the Roman world and who have become, through the course of the Middle Ages, a very distinct people because of the rise of, because of the Crusades and things like that. So people are very aware of Muslims as the other. So they have those ideas about different religious identities. They go to North American peoples and say, what's your religion? Kind of a thing. You're not a Muslim, you're not a Christian, you're not a Jew. And so then they have to kind of try to work it out, So when they're trying to meet people who have either First Nations, the First Nations religions, which are, let's say, very different from each other, but are all part of different kind of a spiritualism or animism, different kinds of ways that are not, let's say, they're not literate, so they're not book-based. They're very different in all kinds of different ways from the ways that Europeans are aware of religion, and so they therefore don't understand it very well. They understand better when they go to the East and they find Buddhist temples or Confucian temples or Hindu temples, because then they can at least see them as being, okay, there's a building here, we kind of get that, Okay, so if we're going to pull back then, though, from this modern idea of what religion is, this ethnocentrically based idea, I want to pull back to like a broader, bigger picture going all the way back to antiquity about what I would say the historic components of religion are as people are, let's say, becoming literate, as we go back to the beginnings of history and when people are kind of making organized religion and ideas. And I'm going to separate these into three kind of basic components that were always the case throughout kind of time in different places. So one is physical information. So religion was a way of having knowledge about physical phenomenon like weather, seasons, disease, plants, and animals, having and transmitting that. Well, I guess the transmitting is specifically the technical part. So the technical arts, which is to say skill in how to make or do things like hunt, make cloth, fire pottery, store food, heal infections, retain and transmit information. So you can kind of see in that, again, these same components that the First Nations elder is talking about. So one of the reasons why when you go hunt, this is a religious practice for them, is because essentially in teaching the next generation how to do it, you are invoking kind of the spiritualism of the whole thing, and you are telling them why this is done, why it's important, how it's done, and that becomes, in a society that isn't literate, that becomes this oral way of transmitting information. So that's a component of it. And finally, this final component, metaphysical ideas, which is to say, how do we know things? What is good and what is bad? And what is the purpose and the meaning of things? Okay, so if we take all of those components, though, now that we've fast forwarded to the 21st century, so we have had this situation where our understanding of physical phenomenon has been entirely supplanted by science, which I would argue is an extremely successful offshoot or component of historic religion. and specifically it's a component that originated in the pagan Greco-Roman world with religious people who were religious reformers like Socrates and Aristotle and other kinds of people. Like when we talked about the Pythagorean theorem, Pythagoras founded what were functionally monasteries where he made a mathematician cult. So he was an early religious leader. And so from those beginnings through the Middle Ages, where we have all of the people that are preserving and retaining and transmitting all that information through all of the books, through all the monasteries and writing in Latin, all the way to when they create universities and things get kicked off to where we are in modernity. We have science, which is now much better at explaining physical phenomena than anything was in the past. So in the past, people were able to, because they didn't have any other way of understanding forces, let's say like lightning, they would anthropomorphize the force. And so they would say, what is the lightning coming from? Well, the lightning is like a person, or it's like a person is throwing the lightning. And it may well be if this or that is done, the lightning will come and get you, and that's kind of a thing. So Zeus will hurl lightning bolts at you, and there will be stories or myths about how that works or why that works. And there will be practices in primitive religions about how you would avert that. For example, by at least trying to appease Zeus in order to make it so that he doesn't do that, or Thor, again, in the Norse mythology, would be the one that's throwing the lightning bolts. And so when in modernity, Benjamin Franklin, for example, created the lightning rod, one of the very serious complaints that his contemporaries had was, if you do this, if you put lightning rods on the end of everybody's houses, you are specifically subverting God's will, which is that God wanted to lightning bolt you, and now you have been able to, using your little tricky rod, you have been able to actually subvert God's will, and so that was one very serious complaint that people had. But more sophisticated religious thinkers like Benjamin Franklin, or he was a deist, were able to say, well, if God kills people with lightning bolts, God can kill you some other way. You're not going to stop him just by, you're not going to stop God just by making a lightning rod, right? So in other words, it was an argument that people made because that's a traditional way that people thought. But at this point, a lot of those kinds of physical explanations that you had been transmitted when people had less awareness of forces, and they still had less awareness of the forces back when Benjamin Franklin was able to experiment with electricity. He wasn't able to explain why things happened, just how things happened. So in other words, not what the purpose of lightning was. He doesn't have any way of knowing that, but rather how to affect what lightning does. What is lightning likely to do? And if you, for example, have a better conductor of electricity that's a little bit higher, then that conductor will attract the lightning, and your house will be, in church especially, will be safe from the lightning bolts. So that's what science has largely supplanted that component, and the leftover roles claimed by organized religions today, I think, can be extremely negative, and they often include insistence on information that's falsifiable. And so one of the examples of this kind of thing I was telling you, that if a way in the past to avoid getting Zeus to throw a lightning bolt at you was that you would bring a particular offering to Zeus's temple, in that same exact way, or in that a direct heir to that tradition, would be a Christian church, maybe a televangelist, who is preaching to you about the prosperity gospel, which is that if you donate lots of money to this particular church, that will immediately incur blessings, because by giving money to God's agent on earth, i.e. that televangelist, then that will mean that you in turn will be blessed. So you are doing this primitive kind of religious transactional thing, which is in Latin it's called do ut des, I give in order that you give. And so in the same way that prosperity gospel still is kind of telling people, if you're doing this, you will be blessed by God in a very material sense. And so that's certainly an example of where religions are not necessarily, some religions anywhere, are still kind of doing some of this stuff, but not necessarily in a way that's very good at all. So However, not all religions are like that. So like I say, there's no question that science is doing a bang-up job in this sphere. But if we go all the way back to St. Augustine of Hippo, who is one of the very earliest great Christian thinkers through which almost the entirety of Western civilization has gone through his lens of thought from antiquity to the early modern times, his advice was, so for example, if you were interpreting Scripture, if you are reading the Bible in such a way that the doctrine that you have or your doctrinal view is incompatible with the consensus of natural philosophy, and science is itself a brand new word. Scientist is a modern word. Before scientists were called in the antiquity, they were called philosophers of nature or natural philosophers. So Augustine said, if natural philosophers are able to explain, let's say, lightning better than you, or let's say, if we go to the Bible, the idea that the sun stopped in the air, and that's making you say for sure you know that the sun goes around the earth and not the other way around. If you say that based on your interpretation and reading of Scripture, and that is incompatible with what science teaches us or what we know science can teach us, that all by itself is blasphemy. So that's blasphemy, is what Augustine says. And so in other words, all the way back to the greatest thinker of late antiquity in Western religion, it's very, very clear that this sort of fundamentalistic anti-science teaching is absolutely condemned. Okay, so in other words, a religion doesn't have to preach the prosperity gospel. Some religions do, and it's unfortunate. Okay, another one of these components that we mentioned was the technical arts. So the religion's role in the technical arts, like for example, having rituals, festivals, myths, when to hunt, when to harvest, to conduct all daily activities. So that's largely been supplanted by technology. So it was really important in a society that was an agricultural society that didn't have clocks. I mean, calendars are themselves a religious invention. So in other words, a calendar was, throughout all of antiquity, was one of the core religious things, and the priests were in charge of figuring out how the calendar worked. And so, for example, when we talked about how we had in the West, we have this Roman calendar, the Julian calendar. Julius, named for Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar had actually adapted an earlier Roman calendar and fixed it based on his role as Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest of ancient Rome. So in addition to being a general, he was also the head priest, and it's as his role as the priest that he adjusted the calendar to bring it back. It was completely out of whack because they didn't have leap years. And so over a certain amount of time, it gets off, right? And we recently have changed that. For me recently, 400 years ago, we changed that to the Gregorian calendar. And that was because Pope Gregory determined that leap years don't quite work. So we're about 10 days off because of every certain number of years you have to not have a leap year, right? And we just had one of those, where after a century you can't have a leap year or a leap day inserted into your leap year, because then the calendar gets off. So every century you don't have a leap year day, right? So whatever it is, like that. So anyway, that was a religious thing. And the reason why a lot of times archaeologists will look around at things like Stonehenge and they'll say, oh wow, guess what? Stonehenge completely lines up to the equinox or something like that. Or all kinds of other kinds of early prehistoric, which is to say pre-literate artifacts and buildings and things like that are actually calendrical. It's because when people were totally dependent on the seasonal cycle for all agriculture and every single thing that they did, exactly when to plant was an incredibly important thing to know, and it was the people that were in charge of figuring that out for you were the priests or the druids or the shamans or something like that. And so that was done through everything like, let's say, having a special festival at that time period, or in other words, that's how the data would be transmitted to people. So again, like I say, we don't think of our calendars now when you're getting out your calendar app on your smartphone. That's no longer more or less like, it's not the same as having like a confessional app for Catholics or something like that, talking to the priest or something like that. The app is not having to be a religious thing. We've now separated that out, or at least we think of it as being separate. But traditional religions still have some leftover rules. One of them is, let's say, transactional prayer. So if you were going to pray and say, and that was like, again, what I was saying with where do it days, I give in order that you give. If I stop, I'm going to give up drinking. I'm going to no longer drink, God, if you'll only just save me from this car accident right now that I'm about, or whatever it is that you were about to jump into. Save me now, and I'll do this kind of a thing. So this kind of a transactional prayer. So that would still be an example of how people are still doing it. Another one that I think people do that isn't within traditional religion, but it shows that people are still completely taken with these kind of ideas. If you ever, let's say, are at a sporting event or you're watching a sporting event from your television, and and the ball is going, in a direction that you want it to go, and you go, go, you're kind of, and you actually move, and you're making, like you're going like this, and you're talking to the ball and then talking to the television, and you're actually with your body kind of moving to make it go. So this is it's actually sympathetic magic, which is this idea that it's the same as in that way as a voodoo doll, which is to say, if you poke the doll in the arm, then the arm, somebody's arm will sympathetically change. If you move like this with your body, you'll move the ball. And so even though people maybe consciously don't think that works, they nevertheless do it, which shows that they actually believe that it works, deep down somewhere, even if they consciously, are themselves skeptical of anything like that. They still do it. So in other words, that's still something that people do whether they consciously think of themselves as being religious or not, and where they're kind of still having what I'd call a primitive religious practice. Okay, so because of, in the West, where we are, in our tradition especially, the Protestant bias against ritual, body, the physical, the experiential, and instead Protestantism was all about the head and the mind, and we obviously, and in our society, we always tend to value mind over matter, and head over body, and being brains over brawn, or those kind of things. So those tend to be values, that are had. And so if you were just doing something physical or sensual, especially, or something like that this is something that's more like, say, lower or base or immoral compared to something that is entirely mental, which is going to be pure. So if you have this pure love, you could have this pure love that is entirely platonic and ideal and things like that, and then you have this carnal. So, all the words here, carnal just means body, right? So everything physical, has all of these senses in our bias. So we have these biases that are just kind of built into Northwestern European society, Protestantism. And so I think this stuff tends to get ignored. So in Protestant religion, almost everything that was ritual, anything that was sensual, anything that anybody did, all got cut out and thrown away almost from the religious tradition, and the center became like what we have here, or the pulpit. And so essentially people would just sit there and harangue you for hours after hours, or explain things, or teach. And so the role became entirely about head and learning and that kind of a thing. However, I would say, though, given the widespread popularity of experiential practices that are imported from Eastern religions, so things like yoga, meditation, Tai Chi, so these are all religious practices, even though as practiced in the West, a lot of people don't consider them to be religious in any way. They're not thinking of themselves at yoga class, as practicing religion. Although, again, this is one of the reasons why when we see Falun Gong in China, where we see people just in a square, and they're all doing exercises, and this somehow is a rebellion against the Chinese government, and the Chinese government is freaked out and they want to stop people from doing that. And why is that case? It's because it is a religious thing. In other societies, it's just not what we put in. When we make our little ... in our ethnocentric way, we just put Tai Chi over here and not religion, or any of those kind of things. But for in other societies, of course, this is a religious practice. So this is an experiential practice, which is, for example, the ideas of centering. And so the way that it would happen in the Western tradition would have been things like, there would have been chanting, but mostly it was what monks or nuns would be doing, right? So a monk or a nun would chant or be in Gregorian chant, or there would be just long practices of silent meditation or prayer. And this is the kind of thing that lay people really didn't do very much in the West. And so for us, it's kind of alien. But as people have sort of seen, whoa, people from the Eastern cultures are doing this, and it's kind of doing something wonderful for me, maybe. And that's why I love to go to yoga, or why I want to be doing Tai Chi or anything like that. In other words, that there is a place here still that we could still have within our spiritual communities or religious communities as we think about it now. And then finally, there's this last component of historic religion, which is metaphysical ideas. And so I'm going to say, compared to the first two, where we had kind of like no real role probably for traditional religions anymore, and then one of a potential role that hasn't been much used, in this one, there's much more of a real role. So I mentioned that science has largely abdicated this realm, which has led in general to a decline in the value of meaning, or the meaning of value. And so what do I mean by that? So when we got to modernity, the proto-Enlightenment, the Enlightenment, when Isaac Newton is talking about universal gravitation, for example, the biggest complaints that his contemporaries had when he was, what he was doing was he was upending Aristotle's laws of motion. So Aristotle had laws of motion, a complete universal system that everybody had pretty well accepted for the preceding 2,000 years. And so now Isaac Newton says, no, wait a second, that doesn't work. That's not how things move. How things move are based on this theory of universal gravitation, theory of gravity. And the problem that people immediately had with it is Aristotle explained why things moved, which is, as far as Aristotle was concerned, was everything has a purpose, everything has a meaning, and the heavier things, their purpose is that they want to go to the center of the universe, which is at the center of the earth, and the lighter things, want to go, away from the center. And in other words, the air wants to go up, and earth wants to go down. And it wants to achieve, everything wants to achieve its place in the whole system, right? Cosmic system. Newton doesn't have any reason why anything should do any of this. So what's the reason why the constant of gravity works that way? Why is the constant that way? Or when we get to any other kind of motion, why is the speed of light the limit for of anything to go nothing can go any faster than that? Why is that particular thing the limit? Why is there the small force? All of those kind of things. So none of those questions. And Newton said his answer was, I don't care. In other words, we can't know that. I'm not worried about that. My point of it, I'm not going to give you the answer to that because I can't answer that. What I'm going to instead say is, this is how it works, and this is how it really works. And Aristotle, if you actually test him on this thing, it doesn't work. So what I can tell you is that through experimentation, and like Galileo was able to prove through experimentation, this actually provides demonstrably verifiable results. But I can't tell you why. So in other words, science is not trying to come up with metaphysics. Science has said, I'm not worrying about that anymore. That was what Aristotle was doing, and Aristotle was wrong about physics, so we don't care about that. So it doesn't mean that people have stopped worrying about what, the meaning of things. What is it? How do you be good? How are you a good person? People have continued to be to wonder, why would we behave any particular way? What is ethical behavior? How should societies operate? Anything like that. But part of the problem, so there are, for example, intensely trained philosophers, academic philosophers in philosophy departments in universities all over the Western world. But part of the problem, and part of the reason why you probably don't know too many of them or haven't heard too many of them on TV. And they aren't, there's not a whole bunch of really well-known popular philosophers that are doing all the rounds, or at least academic philosophers, heavily trained philosophers, is because the discipline has become extremely technical. And so it is actually really, really, really hard for even the smartest people, if you haven't really done the whole training to become a philosopher, to actually understand what the philosophers are saying, because it is intensely technical stuff. That doesn't mean, though, that people don't want to know answers to these questions. So that's why, because in the general abdication of both the field by scientists who are not telling you kind of answers like this at all, or even exploring answers like this, and philosophers who are intensely technical on these things. So instead what we have is this proliferation of things like self-help books, like systems of how you do different things, popular advice gurus. So almost every magazine or online magazine, the very popular thing is to write Dear Prudence or something, where you want to find out, is it okay if my mother-in-law is coming, for me to tell her, absolutely do not bring this because it's my house, or whatever it is. In other words, what is the etiquette for all of these kind of things? What is ethical in all of these kind of questions? And so as a result, that these kind of very popular self-help and metaphysical advice things just proliferate because we don't have really a source for it. And so, in my opinion then, the need here is enormous for this last component of it, for answering for yourself the questions and meaning and value. So why, these questions are things like, why did I make this life choice? What do I really value? Is everything determined? That's certainly some things to think. So are you a determinist? You think that every single thing that you've done or will do is based on everything that is a component of your experience and your genetics together? Or is there some role of free will? If so, what is free will? Those kind of things. What is the self? So in the same way that I was drawing this dotted line around things like natural and artificial, we also have kind of found out that, wait a second, what we even consider ourselves and where the boundaries of that are and what constitutes the self, these are also not necessarily self-evident, right? This is all kinds of different possibilities of that. Why am I unhappy? If you're unhappy, might be a question. What is happiness? What will make me fulfilled? So these are all, I think, questions that people still do struggle with and are interested in, even if they don't necessarily have a place where they're going to for them. So just as a quick, value proposition, I just want to draw this out as a model about what people are. So in my opinion, organized religion in the 21st century has an additional utility, this is a utilitarian argument, in our fast evolving relationship between the individual and society. So if we have the individual and society here in my little diagram, what we have seen, or what we are seeing in the West and North America, is there is this individual disenfranchisement. So if we look at kind of this relationship, my little seesaw here, of the pendulum, of the balancing act between things like the national government and things like megacorporations, everything from Walmart to the big banks, what's your relationship as an individual to something like the national government or to like a megacorporation? And the answer is, obviously, as an individual, you just are not weighted in any way. We got to get out a magnifying glass to try to, see you on the edge of this completely unweighted, unbalanced system, right? So in the case of the megacorporations, the difference in scale means that individuals don't have any individual consequence, and they are relevant only in aggregate, right? So what the corporation cares about for you is that what you as a trend will do. So what was everybody all doing? And then if your sales, you're going to more likely to buy things online on Cyber Monday or something like that, and they want to act in such a way as to maximize their aggregate of you. You individually doesn't matter, though, for them. So that's complete power imbalance disenfranchises the individual and devalues the relationship. So in the past, it may well be that you may have had like brands or something to which you were just intensely loyal, or to companies or to stores or something like that. And those over time, for a lot of people, just break down. And so now, you really kind of maybe are searching around online, you go to the one website and it's like, well, this one's $20 cheaper. You go with somebody else because it doesn't really matter, because you don't have a relationship with the corporation that you really care much about anyway, right? Likewise, we have the same imbalance. I made this for the US government, which is even way more. In Canadian government, people just don't even care about it. So young people don't vote, and they don't care what the government is even doing often, and in huge numbers. But it's also true in this relationship between the tiny individual and the relationship between the government versus the individual in the US, which has resulted in widespread disgust with the political process and disinterest in voting. So in this kind of a relationship then, though, in all of these things, what's missing? And so just to take a totally hypothetical example, if you were to have a free democracy on the one hand and a dictatorship on the other hand. So imagine that the president of a democracy wants to eliminate the dictatorship with the goal of spreading democracy. That's just his entire thought process. So when the military battle is won, the dictator is toppled, and there's free elections, why doesn't that create a free democracy? You have the individuals that are free to vote at the bottom, you have a freely elected new national government at the top. So what's missing? Why doesn't a real democracy emerge in that purely hypothetical situation? And the answer really is, what we tend to forget about, what doesn't evident, in my opinion, is the entire fabric of society, which is to say all the local community institutions that empower and connect the individual to national institutions. So it's all of the things that existed in that wonderful organic little neighborhood that created that neighborhood, which when it's leveled and you create this giant dead zone and there's only the big thing and the inhuman scale person that doesn't connect you to the thing. So it's all of the local institutions, the local boards, you being on your local neighborhood or caring about your local neighborhood council, your local neighborhood ward. It's not just a matter of every 4 years in the United States you vote for like a president at the top and that suddenly reforms the entire universe. Or by bringing in Justin Trudeau, he will now be able to just all by himself, because he's Justin Trudeau, he will make everything perfect now. In other words, it's not a matter of just one thing happening at the top, because in fact, all of society is built on all of the local little institutions that you actually are interconnecting with and interacting with. And when it's and when we are actually able to go to the little shops, when you're able to actually shop at the local bakery and the butcher, and you're interconnecting with people like that, when you have your local charities that are right there in the neighborhood, that's very different than if you're trying to talk to the national ministry. So in my view, though, in the past half century, we have been systematically dismantling our local independent institutions. So we don't have so many of those little shops, or we fortunately do a lot more here in the city than through almost any US cities, where almost everything is just this unending, the big box stores that are the same ones again and again. Here we at least do have the little institutions, so we're a little better off here. And same thing. Same thing is also true by dismantling churches. So everybody, have largely abandoned their local individual churches and congregations. You no longer have that network. Local charities. Instead, you just have a giant national charity that just, the idea for them is simply, they have your phone number, they have your mailing address, they just continuously fundraise to you. And what connection do you have to them? So is it any wonder that many today feel isolated, alone, disenfranchised, and powerless? Because independent institutions have the capacity to leverage power far beyond the capacity of the individuals. In other words, if we actually were parts of all of those little institutions, we would not only, the power balance changes not only because it's not us versus something giant, but rather we are part of something bigger, and there's more things in that scale that we're interacting with. So just that's been my entire case, and so, which just brings us here to where we are in Toronto Congregation here at Centre Place. So we have our little institution that's here. we've hoped that what we've done is we've taken all of the bad pieces of traditional religion, and we have ignored or discarded those, and instead we have a mission here which we think is very positive for everybody. It's the same one that we have listed here that we remembered as our little teaching tool. It's invite everybody into community together, continually learn and grow together, abolish poverty and end suffering together, promote peace and justice together, and live life meaningfully together. And that is my presentation. And I went on longer than I thought I was going to, so I thank you all for staying with me through all this. And does anybody have any, we'd have discussion, or if it's gotten warm in here, if we, go ahead,
No, I
Alf.
just wanted to make a comment. Somewhere in the middle there you had a graphic of a puzzle of removing the negative things,
Yeah,
and then you're left with, I think you had the captioning religion. And I was trying to imagine what it is that makes that box, and I think these initiatives would be excellent.
yeah, right, exactly. So I hadn't labeled those other pieces. It was a mystery. What were those other pieces going to be? And in my view, these are what the pieces are for us in terms of our mission. And that doesn't have to be everybody's mission. This is what the pieces that we find meaningful. But under these banners, it allows us to do a lot of things, And so, like what we have right here, like for under the middle one there, abolish poverty and suffering. So Bryce is here. Bryce is the director of a social housing charity that was able to be sponsored by the church, where we're able to operate 3 apartment buildings in the city for people who were extremely poor, in a lot of cases have mental health conditions, and who otherwise might be homeless if we weren't able to do that. And homelessness and underhousing is a huge issue when you're living in a city. And so being able, as a little group, every one of our little congregations that's involved in supporting that, we're just 2 tiny groups of people, but the amount of good that Bryce and his crew have been able to do is just, uncalculable, compared to what any, individual can do on their own, all of the other things. So we mentioned, promote, continually learn and grow, or promote peace and justice. So we mentioned our Encounter World Religions Center program that is had here. By continuously learning about our neighbors and all of their traditions, that automatically promotes peace. So I had to say that some of the, I've done a lot of study of religion. I hope that I have broken down. I feel like I have done. You always feel like you don't have an accent, you don't have any biases, right? But everybody has biases. And so, I realized before I went to some of the places that I had some pretty, serious biases against, where I'm like scared of going in there, So when we went to the Hare Krishna temple, from whatever it was from growing up when I was a kid, I thought, oh, Hare Krishnas, but they were the nicest people, when you go in there, And so it turns out when you find out about them, when you go in and you meet them and everything like that, that actually helps promote peace, So.
I was interested in hearing that prior to 1492, there was not anything that was tabbed as religion.
We didn't have a word for it.
We didn't have a word for it.
That's
And
right.
I just assumed that religion has been something that went all through our entire history.
And I'll argue, religion is something that goes through our entire history, but we didn't have a special word for it. And so, we have had a bunch of words. So we had a word, the word superstition actually goes all the way back to Roman times. So the Romans routinely called people superstitious when their religion was different from the Roman religion. So in other words, the Romans just thought of, so they believed in, they didn't have a word for their religion, but in particular, they had, piety, they had words like that. So you're pious or you're devoted or anything like that. You could be those kind of things, but that's like a comparative scale. It's essentially saying, Marcus is more pious than, Decius, but it isn't that one of them is religious and one of them is a-religious. It was possible philosophically to be argued to be an atheist in antiquity, so that word existed. And so, for example, the Romans routinely would call Christians atheists because the Christians denied that the Roman gods were real. So they're atheists, But in other words, that was what so the word existed, but essentially that didn't mean that the people weren't religious who were being called atheists. So there wasn't a word religion. So yes. Other questions or comments? Bryce.
I'm kind of interested in the idea of religion as separated from culture. Like the Jewish religion in some respects is a culture. Like there's the Jewish people,
Yeah.
and yet there's the Jewish religion.
Yes.
And so historically, I guess, in their movement or in their evolution, it's been very close to them in terms of living their religion. Like their religion is the way they live their life.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the Western societies, we do tend to have a Western culture.
Yes.
And then we go to church on Sunday, and
Right.
and we do tend to take religious life as separate from secular life. And
Right.
I'm just trying to muddle that through and see
Yeah.
which way we're going on with this.
Well, and I guess I would argue that Jewish people are in the same category as Christians in that regard. So what Bryce is saying is that in the West, we tend to have, since we have created this idea of religion ever since 1500, and so then we have in our own lives bifurcated our lives where we have a thing where we are able to have our religious component of our life, and then we have the other part of our lives that we don't consider to be religious. And that'll be true for Jews too, because in a lot of cases, because the Jewish people are also from the West, and they're interacting very closely. That's why we call it Judeo-Christian culture often. And so they'll, instead of it being on Sunday, it'll be on Friday and Saturday or something like that. But then they're not doing anything. And you can easily be, a person who considers himself Jewish and even spiritual, but they also can be atheist, and they don't go to, and maybe they go just to holidays or not at all. Or maybe they just send money to the synagogue, which they might do for cultural reasons or anything like that. I guess what I'm arguing here is that even though we have cordoned off a zone, that we are dotting it around it and calling it religion in the West, and so for the bulk of the culture in the West, that's Christianity, and the place has been organized churches. So in other words, the Catholic Church and all the different Protestant churches. That in so doing, that separation was in part a social and political movement that was largely anti-clerical. And so what the goal of doing that was functionally, and if you read everybody's rhetoric who were sort of promoting secularism and things like that, going all the way back to the Enlightenment, the goal is to break clerical power, which did need to be broken. So in other words, the clerical monopoly. And so even though, for example, churches had created universities, by the early modern period of time, universities had kind of calcified, and they were teaching Aristotle to the exclusion of more contemporary thought and ideas and new learning and things like that, and it's called scholastics, right? And it's called that because the schools were always teaching this outdated thing. And so what the goal of new thinkers was we have to break this free from the control of the clerics, from the church, because they are exerting this negative backwards force. And so in so doing, people created this idea, they put that the clerics were all involved in this thing that was the church and religion, and then we need to create a space outside of it that isn't controlled by clerics. But in doing that, my argument is actually people have created alternative forms of religion that they just aren't counting as being religion, because they've put that all as a thing that's tied around the dead weight of the clerics, which they want to throw off the bridge. And instead, people are doing the same kind of religious things that have been traditionally religious. Anything that is not, that would be like anything that isn't your your enlightened self-interest of what you're going to maximize, your economic benefit or something like that. So people do all kinds of things that are theoretically have nothing to do with their enlightened self-interest. Why do you, why do I love books? In a certain way, it's not rational. I've done so many things in order to follow my love of books, that have nothing to do with my enlightened self-interest, that kind of thing. Another one would be writing poetry, listening to music, any of these kind of, going on long walks and thinking. There are all these kind of ways that people individually are exercising spirituality or being religious that are not clerically based, and so that's how I would say that we've kind of separated that.
Would you say that our particular group that meets here, it has sort of separated itself from the clerics and the religious to a degree anyway, and that we find ourselves in a comfort zone? I think certainly coming to church, I have found that coming to church on a regular basis has sort of given me a comfort zone.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there are others that are in that same position.
Yep.
Or have the same feelings. And that just because we come, we get something new every week, and it's like having your batteries charged.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, so George is like working on how are we dealing with that, since we have a kind of a traditional structure in our church. We have a regular church service, and yet somehow it's different from. I'm suggesting that it's different from what a more dogmatic or authoritarian church, and I think that it is in fact has accomplished the things that we were trying, that people were worrying about and trying to do when they were trying to break down the authority structures of clericalism and that sort of thing. And the way we accomplish it, I think, in our congregation is that we don't take Scripture literally, for example. We aren't reading it and then just trying to have that be entirely authoritative. Rather, we read Scripture every week when we're having our class or when we're having a sermon, and that is, we actually take it as propositional, and we say, well, what was the author trying to say here? What does that have meaning for my life now? Do we even think do we think it's valid for our times, or do we actually think that the person, is actually doesn't have the kind of information that we are able to, and so they wouldn't be with this proposition that's taking place in this story is something that we would consider unethical, And so the fact that we do that, I think, means that we aren't caught in this dogmatic trap, and instead we are using this space together as a forum to explore meaning. And so to take all of those kind of questions and have a safe space for sharing and dialogue based on all of our various experiences, which are very different from each other. So you have so much more life experience, than youngins like me, so that kind of a thing. And so we find out. So anyway, we find out all that in sharing, and it's not just because of the leader says this, that's what we have to believe or something. Yes.
I really like the wording underneath your yellow icon there, but I'd like to hear your thought process as to how you came to the decision of changing that from invite people to Christ.
Right. So when we have this when I've listed these off, including these are our congregational mission, and these vary slightly from the World Church. Community of Christ is a denomination. Our congregation is a congregation. The World Church denominationally has mostly the same symbols, not the same first one, and they have mostly the same meaning, but they are what I would consider to. I actually feel like that they're more specific, and they're more Christian jargon, including Christian jargon. So for example, the second one, which is the icon of our denominational headquarters temple, so this Nautilus shell building that is in Independence, Missouri, that is sort of the focus of our denominational church, the center place that points us to God, that is the focus. But anyway, that is at the heart of the structure of the church. So we call that one continually learn and grow together. You know, we all of it together is part of the whole thing when we're building community together. So continually learn and grow. In the World Church's lingo on that, it's called develop disciples to serve. And I do like the serve part in that, and all those words. But disciple is a very Christian jargony word that for a lot of people isn't immediately understandable. So on a sign, that just might as well just be, you know, gobbledygook, you know, some kind of a Christian word that, you know, that doesn't necessarily translate to everybody in our neighborhood here. So we live in the downtown as a congregation in the downtown of the most diverse city in the world. And not only is the bulk of all of our neighbors, everybody, this is a multi-use tower that we're in, and there's 16 stories of condos above us. And not only are the people who live in those condos not simply unchurched people who grew up Christian and now don't go to Christian church. They probably grew up Chinese Chinese Buddhist or Confucian and don't go to Buddhist or Confucian temple. You know, they grew up Muslim and they don't go to mosque. In other words, they're from all the different backgrounds, and they just are simply unfamiliar entirely with the Christian, let's say, Christian jargon terms. And so what I've tried to do, or what we've tried to do as a congregation, when we have rephrased these, is to say, well, what is the propositional meaning, again, behind these initiatives? What does that really mean? You know, develop disciples to serve. And so part of that idea is develop disciples. So we're continually learning and growing. It's sort of this proportion of it, which is this adult education thing where it's not like, so there's so many people in our society where we have had, like for example, I mentioned at the beginning of this, how many people have gone to college. But when you do the statistics now and you read the statistics of how many people who have gone to college after they get out of college never read another book the rest of their entire lives. It is a large percentage. It's something like 37%, or it's something horrible. Never read another book the rest of their entire lives, right? And so it's because they just don't care about it anymore. They went to college because they had to or something like that, and now they're living their life and they don't thinking about it. And so one of our values, or one of the things that we value or we're valuing together as a community, is doing things like we're doing right now, which is talking about ideas. You know, continually learning about ideas, continually studying, continually reading, continually thinking about this kind of stuff, because that's one of the things that makes life meaningful. So we use that as our way to explain that meaning of it, as opposed to talking about disciples, which people can learn that word once they're with us, and we can explain our meaning of it. So just before Alfredo, just to mention the other one. So the first one is the one that's most radically different in terms of changing the symbol, because it's a cross is the symbol, as opposed to kind of like a symbol of invitation here, whatever we're doing with the starburst. And it's originally, the one in the World Church is invite people to Christ, as opposed to invite everyone into community. Invite people to Christ. And so part of the issue for that one is, as I think that people in general, especially in a city like this where people are not, in a lot of cases, have a Christian background of any kind, but even people with a Christian background or people who've grown up unchurched, what Christ actually means is confusing to them, and they tend to. I think that there's like we read at the beginning of this presentation about sort of fundamentalism and kind of right-wing bias, and people have this picture of a very particular picture of Jesus, and particularly a picture of Jesus judging, and maybe Jesus being this judge against gay people or against sexual morality, or kind of all kinds of crazy things that people have caught up with this very right-wing picture of a kind of Jesus that has nothing to do with the historical Jesus. And then beyond the historical Jesus, of which people are almost entirely unaware, beyond the Jesus Christs of Scripture, which people are intensely unaware, then there's also Christ as a theological concept and theological proposition, Christ as an idea within the idea of the divine in Christian theology, which people are very unaware of and people have very little understanding of. And part of that idea, though, of Christ in this case is being part of this. Christ means anointed. It means being made sacred. And sacred means separated. So taking a place off and separating out this portion of your life to be spiritual. And so in our case in the denomination, we name the denomination Community of Christ. In some ways, those two words I think are also interchangeable. And so it's, Christ of Christ or Community of Community. It's also, they're interconnected. And so one of the things that we're trying to bring here is that we want to bring everybody into the community. So Alf, you were going to.
You're much more eloquent, and that was exactly what I was looking at. That I really like your symbols because they truly represent that welcoming message that we have. It's contradicting to have a cross or invite people to Christ and have the rainbow symbol at the same time because, popular community here around, especially in Toronto, they don't necessarily jive because one is against the other in general understandings.
Right.
And so I really
So that was our thinking in terms of that. It's not that we're not, I mean throughout our tradition in our church and actually in Protestantism, the cross wasn't often used as a symbol and actually historically for Christians either. It's become a symbol more recently and it's important. And it's not that we don't use it. We have a cross that, that we have on the communion table and things like that. It's not meant to hide it or anything like that, but we're talking about just in order to explain meaning always. And so as opposed to when people are making first impressions or when they're seeing things, they are immediately activating all of their biases and everything like that. And what I would prefer to do always, instead of hitting on and having their synaptic biases fire, I would rather say, wait a second, our actual meaning is here. Listen to what we mean by this, and then we can get and learn jargon later. So our meaning for jargon is different. Okay. Well, thank you so much for help having this worked for streaming. Has it worked the whole time?
Yeah,
Okay. Well, if people are on, that's okay. I really appreciate it, and we're going to try to be doing streaming of all of our events to the extent that we're capable. So thank you so much to Community Place for setting us up with that. We are hoping to have lots of partnership with Community Place. It's a fantastic group and expertise and everything like that, and we'd love for you guys to use our facility anytime, and we really appreciate this partnership. And we'll just say bye to everybody, and we're going to have snacks here, so please have snacks.